So Autumn Alexandra Lake is a member of the Minnesota Anti-War Committee and a member of the United National Anti-War Coalition's Administrative Committee. So take it away, Autumn.
So first of all, I want to express that I always experience a great deal of pride and honor when I get to share space with such principled organizers who are steadfast in their commitment to organizing for peace and justice. I'm just very excited to be here and share this space with you. When it comes to the current wave of anti-Asian hate in the United States, I think it's really easy to view it as some sort of aberration, right? Something that's unique to this particular period of time, especially with how rapidly hate crimes against Asian folks had risen in the past year. You know, and this has been accompanied by messages claiming that, oh, this isn't America, this isn't us, this isn't how we operate, this is something completely unusual, unprecedented. But what I hope to illustrate to you today is that this is very much who the United States is. This is actually a critical component of how the United States operates. It is a recurring element of American history. US foreign policy mandates that other countries must fit into a particular political and economic model, one that places the US as the global center of political and economic power. Any country that declares independence from this particular model eventually faces the overwhelming force of the United States and its allies. I mean, you can look at what happened to Guatemala in 1954, Honduras in 2009, Bolivia just last year. These are all examples of the US overthrowing entire democratically elected governments that deviated from US interests, right? Likewise, other countries that have been successful at repelling, you know, the sort of US mode of operation, countries like Venezuela, countries like Iran, have continuously faced mounting pressures from the United States. East Asia was arguably the hotbed for national liberation and independence movements for much of the 20th century. Vietnam's efforts to kick out US and French colonizers results in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. And to this day, you know, Vietnam faces economic sanctions designed to inhibit their economy and inhibit their ability to import goods. Sanctions imposed by the United States. And, you know, 15 years prior, the Korean War, that the US was heavily involved in, results in the death of 3 million Korean citizens, civilians, in fact. And to this day, you know, North Korea is treated as the world's largest villain, faces, you know, again, economic sanctions, faces the threat of US military intervention nearly constantly. In tandem with these measures are, you know, propaganda campaigns that are frankly racist in nature to paint people of these countries, especially Korea, as monstrous, as, you know, being anti-democratic, as committing human rights violations. This brings me to China. China is the main subject of US foreign policy nowadays. It is the US's campaign against China is the engine fueling the current wave of anti-Asian hate. Now, China has been a country that's been colonized, recolonized, divided up by world powers from, you know, the US, Japan, various European countries. And after decades of struggle, in 1949, they were able to declare their independence. The US has not let them live it down since. And in recent years, the US has been building towards what the Pentagon calls a great power rivalry between the US and the People's Republic of China. This is kind of akin to the Cold War that took place between the United States and the Soviet Union once upon a time. The US in this process has sought to destroy any semblance of normal relations with the People's Republic of China in favor of escalating conflict, in favor of enacting new economic sanctions in favor of engaging in military maneuvers that have the potential of turning this new Cold War into a hot war at a moment's notice. In 2012, the Obama administration enacted its pivot to Asia, which is a foreign policy strategy that gradually restructured the US's focus away from destabilizing the Middle East, not entirely, just partially, and instead oriented it towards a strategy of military and economic containment of China. This change in the Pentagon's strategy marks a transition from mere economic competition with China to open conflict with China. In 2015, Robert Daly, and I'm not making this name up, the director of the Kissinger Institute on China, don't laugh, stated that even if China were to change, even if they were to adapt our constitution and our laws wholesale, we should still try to limit their growth purely because we shouldn't have a peer competitor. We must stop them, even if it means we have to push them back into poverty. So what we see is that, while the US has spent, nearly 70 years considering China to be an enemy of sorts and a competitor, it is within the past 10 years that this process has ramped up in severity. In order to manufacture consent for such a ramping up of tensions, naturally, it has to be accompanied by a propaganda campaign. It has to be accompanied by the demonization of this country. It has to be accompanied by the ability of the United States to justify any actions it takes in this conflict. To this end, the United States has done what they've done in dozens of other countries around the world. They've taken issues in those countries, whether they're real, whether they're exaggerated, whether they are entirely fabricated. That part doesn't matter. What does matter is that they're able to use those as fuel for the fire in generating enmity towards this particular country. The US threw its weight behind the Hong Kong protests, which came in response to a proposed extradition treaty between Hong Kong and the People's Republic of China and Taiwan and Macau. In 2018, a Hong Kong college student murdered his 28-year-old pregnant girlfriend while vacationing in Taiwan. Hong Kong law does not allow his extradition. And that would be like if here in the United States, someone was able to escape justice by going to Hawaii just because the federal court is located in California. A lot of these protests, despite having the veneer of a movement for justice, were US-backed, often appeal to US and pro-colonial, pro-imperialist sentiments. They were met with the support of right-wing slime in the US, such as Senator Ted Cruz, Senator Marco Rubio, and they received support and funding from the National Endowment of Democracy. So regardless of whether this particular movement had, the makeup of a movement for justice, the US had positioned itself to ally with it, specifically to disrupt China. It wasn't about the people of Hong Kong. It was about applying that political pressure. And of course, this campaign also resulted in a further demonization of the People's Republic of China. Likewise, the US enjoys criticizing China for its treatment of the Muslim majority Uyghur ethnic group in Xinjiang. Now, no country is above criticism, and claims of human rights violations need to be taken seriously. But I will say that the US's own history of claiming to support marginal ethnic groups in an attempt to malign its current geopolitical targets is worrisome. There is a certain audacity to the US condemning China for concentration camps, for example, when it's maintaining its own true-to-life concentration camps at the US-Mexico border. There's also a certain audacity in the US claiming to have the interests of Muslims in mind, despite having instituted the Muslim ban, despite having spearheaded the continued spread of anti-Muslim hate, despite being active in suppressing Muslim-majority countries all over the world. in the anti-war movement, we're interested in hearing about this issue from other Muslim majority countries in the region. But in the meantime, we always ask ourselves, would this sort of thing justify US intervention? Would it benefit Muslims in China? Would it benefit Muslims in the US if the US continued to pressure China to ramp up tensions, to nearly instigate war with China? And we don't believe that a US war with China would do any good for Muslims around the world. But that's not the point of the US's intervention in the first place in this particular issue. The reason the US chosen this issue, in addition to other issues around China, in addition to claiming that the source of COVID, in addition to claiming that they're suppressing democratic movements, is because this allows for the continued demonization of China and can preemptively justify any actions the US has taken against China. You can see this in the fact that in just the past few years, negative perceptions of China have increased in the US population from 47% to 73%. And excuse me. Another element of that is quite worrisome is, I'm 30 years old. I just turned 30 pretty recently, in fact. Most of my life was defined by the US's war on terror. And one thing I always distinctly recall about that is at any time the US decided, oh, we're going to invade Afghanistan, we're going to invade Iraq, we're going to interfere in Syria, the kind of campaigns that led up to that led to an increase in anti-Muslim and anti-Arab violence in the United States. But also that spilled over into other groups that didn't even fit under that umbrella. Many folks who were from other from other parts of Asia wound up facing initial violence. Other religious groups such as Sikhs wound up facing additional violence. Likewise, this increased demonization of China is affecting more than just Chinese folks. First of all, it affects more than just China. It affects Chinese folks living in the United States. It affects other East Asians living in the United States. That's why so many of these victims, you find out they're Korean, they're Vietnamese, they're Japanese. It is no matter to the rambling racist right which part of Asia they come from, because the engine of racism doesn't make those distinctions in these cases. Furthermore, I think it's important that if we want to stop Asian hate, if we want to resist the rise in anti-Asian sentiment, it becomes imperative that we have to resist the US war machine as well. The US imperialism, the US war machine is the engine that is generating this hate in the first place and spreading it to the US population. And they'll always cloak it in, the supposed genuine concern for human rights. The supposed interests of Muslim majority ethnic groups, the supposed sympathy for the people of China, the supposed concern for the privacy and safety of people in the US, the backing of so-called movements for justice. These are all just a facade used to manufacture consent for the US's campaigns to undermine another sovereign state. And Asians in the United States are a major casualty of this propaganda war. This is an issue that's very important to me personally as an anti-imperialist, as an anti-war activist. Seeing other people, seeing innocent people face additional racist violence as a result of the US being unable to stand the fact that another economy may take the stage as the premier economic power in the world. And there are so many that see domestic issues and foreign policy issues as entirely separate. You know, why do I care about what's going on with the US and China when we've got problems here? They're the same problems. They are intrinsically linked, they are part of the same system. We don't solve these problems by just focusing on one area at a time. The whole damn system is guilty as hell, and the US war machine is just one part of that. And it deserves just as much attention for all this anti-Asian hate as any other part of this racist system. Thank you.
Thank you, Autumn. Lots of good food for thought there. Moving along to Ryan Ahmadian. Ryan is the co-founder of Diaspora United, organizer with Dallas Houseless Committee, and an organizer with Dallas Stops Evictions. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. That was a great presentation, Autumn. Very great points. It's going to be hard to follow that up. A lot of the points that I make will just be reiterating some of the same points that Autumn made because they're very valid. You know, those are the concerns that we should be focusing on when it comes to the sudden surge in anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian violence that we've seen suddenly over the past year. To kind of go backwards on that, you know, we saw this surge start a little bit during the beginning of the pandemic, right? During the Trump administration, when the United States chose to point fingers, right, and propagate lies about the origination of the virus instead of taking accountability in the lack of preparedness of their own country, the United States, and creating conditions that would be safe and economically feasible for their own citizens. So we started to see many tropes, many Orientalist tropes going against China specifically, but also against Chinese people, right? Because we understand that even though the State Department, even though the bourgeois media fails to make the distinction between criticizing the Chinese government and the Chinese people, it shouldn't get lost in that subject that a recent study that's been put out by a recent study that's been put out by the Ash Center, which is a group that works in conjunction with Harvard University. It was a long-term study that came to a conclusion where 95.5% of respondents were either relatively satisfied or highly satisfied with the Chinese government in Beijing. This is a study done among Chinese citizens in China throughout many regions, and there's more information based off this study. You can look it up and go into the details more. So when criticisms are made of the government, a government that materially benefits its people and looks out for the conditions of its citizens, then you're also creating that environment for the United States and its hegemonic attitude that it has towards the rest of the world by wanting to maintain themselves as the stronghold economically and politically. These kinds of critiques that are based in anti-Asian, based in xenophobic and Orientalist attitudes create those conditions for violence to be faced against Asian people here in America, right? Which is what we see play out in real time, more so recently than others. But this isn't something that's just started in the last year during the pandemic, right? I mean, we can go back all the way to the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And since then, how Autumn had mentioned, the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, even during the Chinese Revolution, during the Cold War against with the Soviet Union, China had been brought into that slightly as well. There are many lies that are made against Eastern Asian governments, especially those who are typically socialist governments or communist governments, because many of these racial tropes and Orientalist tropes are rooted in anti-communism, because it's more than just white supremacy, right? It's the political and economic. There's political and economic means behind it, because that's what is the driving force behind all of this. And to go off of that and the points that Autumn made, how this is a tactic that is nothing new to America, right? They use this to justify wars in the Middle East. They use it to justify military intervention in Latin America. And they do it, all over the world, which is why it's important for us to not focus on these acts of violence in the abstract, and to focus it on a more large-scale systemic way, in the way that the government, which we participate in the country that we live in, carries out these kinds of tactics against countries in the global South, and how not only does it affect these governments who are intended to, good or bad, right? That's a conversation we can have for another time, but they're intended to advance the people and the sovereignty of those nations. And the US, clearly, that is not in the interests of the US, which is why they need to contain and maintain them, and present themselves. The US should present themselves as a sort of global superpower, which is one reason why China is the focus of many of the recent attacks that the US has been carrying out, both through the State Department, but also through the media, right? We've seen many articles published recently with very reactionary headlines that are intended to grasp the attention of the reader, but also you'll see the pictures that are included with this to paint the Chinese government as sort of like authoritarian, or so these kinds of things, all of these which play into our culture as Americans, right, is what feeds into that that surge of violence that we're seeing. And to go off of that, we notice how China, as a government, is a lifeline to many of the governments that are subjected to economic sanctions, subject to military aggression. And because of that, those countries who cooperate in a multipolar way with China, who is an enemy, who has been deemed an enemy of the United States by the State Department, they fall into that crosshair as well. They get the same kind of attention, maybe not as much, but they do get that attention from the U.S. imperialist apparatus, whether it's through the military, whether it's through the State Department, the CIA, or just the kind of ruling class bourgeois media that we see, or the mainstream media, as they would like to call it. And one thing that we've seen recently, I, as someone, an Iranian who was born in America, recently there was a 25-year cooperation deal that was signed between Iran and China to basically create an alternative to the U.S. hegemony, right? Create an alternative to the U.S. dollar, which dominates the whole world, and the trade, the atmosphere for trade that takes place and has taken place historically. And that is a direct threat, to the U.S. as a global superpower. And so they will do anything in their power to combat that, and to maintain themselves as a superpower. And the tactics that they use to maintain this white supremacy is by using Orientalist tropes, painting these countries and the people in these countries as not having any kind of agency or autonomy to govern themselves and to assert their sovereignty because they just can't, right? They're not smart enough to do that. They don't have the abilities to do that. And that kind of rhetoric plays back here at home. And we see the far right grasp those rhetorics and use it to justify the violence that they perpetuate on an individual scale against Asian people, brown people, and even Black people, right? Because African countries and countries that are Black and brown are also subject to this kind of discrimination, which is probably not the best word to use, but tactics, whether they're Orientalist, xenophobic, anti-Black. And that's something that we need to understand as people living in America, understand when these things are presented to us, whether it's through an article, through a movie, through TV, through the news, on social media. There's a lot of mediums that they use in order to push this propaganda and push this rhetoric out there. And we need to be able to identify it when we see it and understand how these things contribute to what's happening right now in real time. It is not in the abstract, they contribute to them, and it is a result of these wars that take place, result of the campaigns that take place to manufacture consent for these wars. And so I'll leave it off on that note, right? Like I said, Autumn was able to cover a lot of the ground in a very articulate way, and kudos to her for doing that. That was a great presentation. And I'll open the floor to Masao. Thank you again for having me in this panel discussion. It's an honor to be a part of this group. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ryan. And we're building all the time here. And I think it certainly, these are important, so many things that are important to repeat, you know. We get it, we deepen our understanding of these things. And I did want to, for all the participants, if you have any questions or any comments for the speakers after Masao Suzuki speaks, if you will direct those to Dan, and he will feed them through, and we'll go through them and touch on the comments and the questions. Okay. Now, Masao Suzuki is a professor of economics at Skyline College and a member of the NOC Outreach Committee in San Jose. Professor?
Oh, thank you, Kit, and thanks everybody for coming tonight. As Kit mentioned, I am a member of the Neomachi Outreach Committee, or NOC. Neomachi is a Japanese name for Japantown here in San Jose, and it's one of the 3 historic Japantowns that are remaining in the United States. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the work I've been doing and others have been doing in the Japanese American community that are relevant to the issue of war and war abroad and racism here in the United States. The main activity of NOC is to do an annual Day of Remembrance program to commemorate the incarceration of Japanese Americans in concentration camps during World War II. So to get to that point, on December 7th, 1941, the Empire of Japan bombed the US military base at Pearl Harbor, and immediately the FBI and military agents began to round up what ended up being thousands of Japanese immigrants who were interned in Department of Justice camps. And these were community leaders, religious leaders, business leaders, cultural teachers, et cetera. And they basically stripped the community of the traditional leadership. And a few months later, on February 19th, 1942, then President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which was the basis for incarcerating 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent in concentration camps in the United States. And I think it's important to state that right from the beginning, There was resistance to the camps. There were those who refused to go to camp, and they fought their legal battles all the way up to the Supreme Court, but unfortunately lost because the Supreme Court accepted the argument of national security. There was more than 10,000 Japanese Americans who refused to sign a loyalty oath after they were put in camp, because many of them were banned by law from becoming US citizens. Japanese immigrants could not naturalize in the United States. So for them to declare loyalty, and there was another question, to forswear loyalty to the Emperor of Japan would have made them, in fact, legally stateless people, because they would have renounced their Japanese citizenship and they could not become US citizens. And then last, but very significantly and connected to the war effort, there are well over 100 Japanese Americans who refused the draft in the camps. This is probably the largest single event. We're over 100 at one concentration camp at Heart Mountain, where many of the Japanese Americans from where I live now in San Jose were incarcerated, refused their draft orders and were sent to military prisons in different parts of the country. There were strikes at different concentration camps protesting the conditions, and then also and the aftermath of the war, close to 15,000 Japanese Americans returned to Japan, largely disillusioned with their experience here in America. But in the post-war, the Cold War period, there was very little discussion about the camps. And it was really only in the 1970s where a new generation of Japanese Americans, these were the third generation, or Sansei, of which I am a member of. So our parents were born here. We're the grandchildren of Japanese immigrants, began a movement for a redress or an official government apology and reparations or monetary compensation. And we were largely inspired by the large anti-war movement of the 60s and 70s, and also of the struggle of African Americans in the civil rights and Black liberation movements of, again, the 60s and 70s. And I think this struggle was very important, not only because it actually won a major victory, getting an official government apology and $20,000 in redress after more than a dozen years of fighting, but it has some important lessons, I think, for the struggle against violence against Asians today. And so one of them is the importance of support from other oppressed nationalities. African Americans in particular offered a very important support, because in the early period, there were a number of Japanese Americans, Congress people and senators, but they, well, I guess I can be quoted on this, they wouldn't touch the issue with a 10-foot pole, And so they were, anyway, they were afraid of being labeled or typecast or whatever. So it was actually one of the leading proponents of in Congress of the redress and reparations movement was African-American Congressperson Marvin Dimely, who represented the district that is now represented by Congresswoman Maxine Waters. So this solidarity was very important in the early period of getting the movement off the ground. And I think in the aftermath of the movement, one of the reasons we started the Day of Remembrance program started here in San Jose in 1980. So as part of the redress and reparations movement, but even after winning the victory, we've continued for more than 30 years to try and spread the lesson that discrimination and violation of people's civil rights is not right, even in times of a war. And this was very important because the Japanese American community was one of the first groups to express solidarity with American Muslims after September 11th, 2001, where the US began what was in effect a a war on Islam, although they tried to call it terrorism, although in fact, that's again ironic. I think Autumn made some references to this, since the US military has been carrying out terrorism on a world scale for more than 100 years. And so, in fact, a number of professional Islamophobes, such as Daniel Pipes, in fact, were on a campaign to overturn the verdict on the World War II concentration camps, saying that, well, this is going to make it harder for us to put American Muslims in camp if and when we think it's necessary. So I think that the struggle was not just a victory for us, but in fact, it helped prevent some of the worst from history repeating itself with American Muslims with the Patriot Act and everything. Now, the modern anti-China, anti-Asian American issue, I think it can be traced back over 20 years to the rise of socialist China, and the US began taking a more and more confrontational stance towards China. And at the same time, you started to see early signs of repression of Chinese Americans. And one of the better known ones that actually dates back to 1999 was the case of nuclear scientist Wen Ho Lee, who was actually, ironically, he was from Taiwan. You know, he wasn't, had no relation to the People's Republic of China, and yet he was charged with spying, and that was later reduced to unauthorized, you know, taking home data to work on, which a lot of people, you're not supposed to do that, but a lot of scientists do that. There's a case of Captain James Yee, who was a chaplain for the prisoners at Guantanamo. And again, he was charged with spying for unspecified foreign power. And then eventually all the charges were dropped against him. And even more recently, there are some quite, you know, to me, outrageous cases of Chinese American professors being investigated by the FBI and losing their jobs, allegedly spying for China for doing things like sending a Chinese classmate information on how we pay for our dams in the United States, because he had asked, how do you pay for dams there? Because he was actually a vice minister of the interior, something like that. And they, you know, how it's a public finance question. It's not a national security question. And another Chinese American professor was allegedly sending classified material to China. It turns out to be schematics for a microwave oven. And so, you know, the FBI didn't even check, ask a engineer, what is this schematic? Because they would have been told, oh, that looks like a microwave thermometer. So indeed, that's what was going on. And then, of course, as things deepened, as the pandemic deepened here over the last year, and the failure of the United States to control the pandemic, the violence against Asian took a big, there was a big surge. There's been over or close to 4,000 documented cases, and many, many more that have not been reported. Some of the more vicious ones happened about a year ago, where a Burmese family, including a 6-year-old child and a 2-year-old child, were stabbed by an assailant in Texas. And of course, we know the very horrid killings in Atlanta recently, where the main target were Asian American businesses, and 6 of the 8 people who were murdered were Asian American women. And I do agree with the other speakers that while the Biden administration has given up the open promotion of white supremacist organizations and individuals that had surrounded and supported Donald Trump, I think he's actually intensified conflicts with China, building up the US military in Asia, not dropping any of Trump's tariffs, and in fact expanding different economic sanctions on China, and really stepping up a lot of attacks on China. And so, in ending, I just want to say, I don't think the government can be preparing for war with China while at the same time claiming to protect Asian Americans. So maybe I'll end there and take up more points in when question and answer.
Thank you, Professor. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. We can open it up, I think, for a Q&A. We don't have a lot of questions thus far. We did have a comment from Yusuf who said that it may encourage minorities to unite once and for all to combat the kind of racisms that we are currently facing in our nation. One group cannot fight alone, just like you cannot clap with one hand. Good point. Thank you, Yusuf. So let's see if we have so again, if you want to comment or ask a question, send that, if you will, send that to Dan Sullivan, and he will post that here. Let's see. This is, Autumn mentioned something about Guatemala. What happened in Guatemala? Autumn, would you talk about what you were referring to there?
Yeah, I would love to talk about what I was referring to there. So, of course, everyone in this group probably already knows that the U.S. was involved in many regime change operations throughout Central and South America throughout the 20th century. One of which was the installation of a dictator by the name of Hamas in Guatemala. It was the U.S.-backed coup after the Guatemalan people democratically elected their own government that was more representative of their interests instead of U.S. interests. And it's a situation that could fit loads of other countries in Central and South America if you just swap the dates and the names a little bit. So, that's why I also brought up because that happened in 2009. That was, a fairly recent one. It happened in Venezuela multiple times. Happened in Bolivia last year. Basically, if the U.S. has interest in a place, they're definitely in subverting democracy in order to uphold U.S. interests.
Okay, thanks, Autumn. You're cutting out there a little bit, but thank you for responding to that. Let's see. Let's see. Is that Professor Suzuki wanting to say something about? He has something more to add here. So, Professor.
Yeah, I was just going to comment a little more on Yusuf's statement about the need to unite. And I think that's very, very true. And I think that it's, very encouraging to see the signs of unity of different, nationalities of Asians coming together. I know we had a forum. We're all we're all at home on my campus, so it wasn't an in-person, it was another Zoom meeting, but we had actually over 80 participants, and that's where my background Zoom screen, one of the students who spoke at it actually developed that for me. And it was really, I found it really good that, the speakers included myself, who's Japanese American, a Chinese American, a former student of mine, and actually a Vietnamese American former student of mine. And so I think that unity is very good. I think it's important to remember that, in fact, Asian Americans do come from very different backgrounds, the cultures, the history. Many nations have been colonized. A few, like Japan, not only weren't colonized, they have a sorry record of colonizing other countries. So there are these contradictions historically in Asia, but I think once we get here in the United States, our treatment has been very similar. And in fact, of course, again, for the horrendous killings in Atlanta, even though it's to me and many people, motivated by this anti-Chinese hate, but in fact, most of the women killed were actually Korean Americans. And I think that's an unfortunate fact among racists, is they don't know and they don't care what nationality you are. It wasn't anything so violent. It was graffiti and vandalism 30 years ago on the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And the homes that were vandalized here in San Jose, one was a Vietnamese American home and the other was Filipino American home. And, on one hand, I was sort of mad that their homes are being vandalized, but on the other hand, it's like, these people, they don't know that Vietnam and the Philippines were invaded and occupied by Japan and fought wars of resistance, and yet they're, trying to blame them for what Japan did 50 years ago. So it is something I think we have to work towards. And I think the other thing that's very important for the, more for the general American public is to emphasize the distinction between Asian Americans and our status here in America and what's going on in Asia, because a lot of times those two things, I think, get glossed over much more so than other, there's particularities of how discrimination affects different nationalities. And I think one of the particularities of Asians is we're the perpetual foreigner. And, I've had people, well, the worst case, a common, when did you get here? And, well, I got here about 66 years ago when I was born. I usually don't answer the second one. And then I even had the incident of one person that I said I was born here and they told me, no, you weren't. And at first I got sort of mad and then I thought, well, wait a moment. And I said, why? Do you know I wasn't born here? And then they said, because of your accent. And, and I just thought, well, if they're hearing an accent, I'm not going to be able to convince them I don't have an accent. So I just told them, well, you can be born here and still have an accent. And I think that is true. And that sort of, they backed down. So I think they were more ignorant than hostile, but it was just an interesting experience. I should stop.
Okay. Let's see, we've got several people. Someone wants to know, are there any documentaries or books that she can read to learn more about discrimination against Asians in this country? Any suggestions for documentaries or books that she can learn about more about discrimination against Asians in this country? Any thoughts off the top of your head? Maybe we'll give that a little bit of thought and then come back to it. Okay. Also, Julie was wanting to know thoughts about Myanmar, the events. I'm assuming the recent events in Myanmar or Burma. Anybody want to comment on that? Let's see. Let's see. Someone else says there have been a lot of confrontations between the U.S. and North Korea. What can be done to bring a long-term peace to that area? North Korea. That's a $64 question.
No one else would like to go. I can add something to
Go
that.
ahead, Ryan. Go ahead.
So what could be done to bring peace to Korea, right? The Korean region, mainly peace and unification between North Korea and South Korea, because essentially that's what the Korean people want, right? The division that was brought there was through imperialist intervention, and once again, the U.S.'s inability to come to the terms with a people, asserting their sovereignty and self-determination towards a political economic system that would threaten their hegemony to their political economic system. So basically, the main thing and the only thing to do would be for the U.S. to withdraw troops from South Korea, and for the U.S. to allow the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Republic of Korea to sit at the table and allow them to negotiate and come to an understanding as far as unifying their people and unifying their country. Because as we've seen historically, as long as the U.S. has been a part of that discussion and been trying to assert themselves as the main voice in that discussion, when America is not Korean, and the decision that would be made should not be made by America, because it's not, it doesn't, it affects them in the way that we know, but it doesn't affect them as far as their self-determination goes, which is why they should not be a part of that discussion, and they should withdraw troops and withdraw their military bases, and so on and so forth.
So you're suggesting giving up our hegemony? Okay, let's see. There have been a lot of confrontations between, we've already talked about that. I really appreciate your stance on Islamophobia. The JAL in Dayton, Ohio has been a great organization to coordinate with. I hope that we can continue that effort moving forward. This is also from Yusuf. Let's see. The U.S. government under both Trump and Biden talks about a special role for the U.S. in pushing human rights in the world. What do you think about that?
So the assertion that the U.S. is the paragon of justice in the world and the torchbearer of human rights is one of the most offensive things I've ever heard in my entire life. I'm being completely honest and not exaggerating even slightly. First of all, it's absolutely heinous considering the fact that the U.S. commits human rights violations on a daily basis. I'm based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. The ground zero for the mass uprising that took place across the United States because of the extrajudicial killing of an unarmed Black man, George Floyd. This is the same United States that, using its racist police system, actively targets poor communities of color, that actively promotes a prison system, the largest in the world, with not only just the largest number of prisoners, per capita, but the largest number of prisoners in general. This is the same United States that's currently running concentration camps for migrants, and who previously ran concentration camps for Japanese Americans. This is the same United States that has been locked in endless war since the 1800s, that has overthrown democratically elected governments in Bolivia, Venezuela, Guatemala, Honduras, Iraq, Iran like 3 times, is attempting to in Syria, is attempting to in China, is currently involved in drone strike campaigns in Somalia, is currently involved in special operations actions across the entire African continent, is trying to pressure even some of its allies to take military and economic stands against its target nations. The U.S. has no ground to stand on when it comes to the question of so-called human rights. And the notion that the U.S. has any role in policing human rights anywhere in the world is one that needs to be combated every waking moment. That is not something you can let slide. I don't care if it's in casual conversation. I don't care if it's in organizing spaces. We don't let that one slide, because that is the justification for every single atrocious thing the U.S. ever does. And that's all.
Hear, hear. Yes. Okay. All right. Let me try to get back here to the chat. Let's see if we have any other questions here. Let's see here. Back to Myanmar, I had heard that a group or possibly more than one group here in Dallas was planning a rally calling attention to the inhumane conditions in Myanmar this coming Saturday, April 10th, but I haven't seen any public postings or flyers about it. This is from Patricia. Anybody aware? Yeah.
Sorry, I actually have a contact who's involved in some of the organizing for DFW with Myanmar, who I ran into randomly. But one of the freelance journalists here in Dallas covered one of their past rallies in Fort Worth. So I have a contact with one of the organizers for some of the Myanmar community here in DFW that are doing actions, but I wanted to just see if anyone had thoughts on what was going on here, because I didn't realize there was such a big community of people from that kind of area here in Dallas, where I am and where I grew up.
Anybody want to add to that? Have anything to add to that conversation? Let me see if there's anything more. Let's see. Masao?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I think, we have actually a lot of Burmese students at my college. Evidently, the area where my college is near Daly City, right south of San Francisco. It's evidently the center of for immigration from Myanmar to the United States. And I've had classes where I've had more Burmese students than white students in my class. So there's quite a few, and I think the recent military coup is quite unpopular among the students that I know. But I think for those of us, here in the United States, I think there's two things that are important to remember. I think it's important not to conflate the issue of violence in Asia with the violence against Asian Americans, because they're really two different things. I mean, the violence that's going on there is basically an internal matter. It's a military coup and repression thereof, but it's really not connected to the wave of violence here in the United States. And I'm not trying to defend it, but I do think it's important not to conflate or confuse the two, because I've seen it happen even on my own campus, where people try and, when we're talking about the violence against Asian Americans, it would, they try and put in stuff about Asian. I mean, you know, I think the same thing if you're having a discussion about police violence and the death of George Floyd, and then someone starts raising, oh, well, what about the violence in Africa, which there is, right? There's fighting going on there. I think most people would say, well, wait a moment, that's not the same issue. So I'm not trying to dismiss it as an issue, but I do want to point out, I think it's important that those two are distinct. And then the second thing I wanted to say is I think, you know, there's been a lot of very sympathetic coverage towards the protesters and, you know, I think antagonistic coverage against the military. And I think it's important for us to realize that our news media here, the corporate news media, has an agenda. It's not fair and balanced, as Fox says, that, you know, for example, the New York Times was one of the big proponents of the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, right? That paved the way for the war in Iraq. And of course, as it turns out, no such weapons existed. And I think it's interesting to note, say, the contrast between the coverage, to me, the coverage of the military coup in Myanmar, and then the coup that happened in Egypt, where a democratically elected but Islamist government was overthrown by the military, who happened to be, the military in that case, happened to be very pro-US and put the country back on a pro-US path. And you really didn't hear anywhere near as much about the protests or people being killed or stuff like that, in my opinion, or at least I didn't see it in the media. And I read a lot of the main, you know, Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, to name a few. So anyway, that's just a comment on that. And there was an earlier question I wanted to get to about books or films to read. There's many, many different films, and I can't think of one that you can sort of encompass the history of Asian Americans here. But there is a book, it's my favorite book, and I especially think for a sort of a beginner or someone who's new to the issue, it's highly readable. And that's a book called Strangers from a Different Shore by Professor Ronald Takaki. And it's really, I really like it because it covers, you know, the different Asian nationalities. And of course, no book can cover everything. And of course, if I had to do a critique, I could find things wrong with it. But I think that's a great introduction, and also because he just has a great style. You might even, he's passed away, but you might even find some videos of him on the internet, because he's of Japanese Hawaiian origin, and they have a term calling talk story, and he can just do that. He just lays out the history as a story, and you end up thinking you're, you know, hearing your grandpa telling a story about family rather, but in fact, it's about Asian American history. And so I think he's also very good because he tries to relate it and how it's interrelated, not only among the different Asians, but also with the experience of African Americans, Chicanos, Latinos, Native Americans in this country. So I don't know who raised that question, but I do.
Thank you. Well, let's just repeat. So that's Strangers from a Different Shore by Professor Ronald Takaki. Is that Takaki? Takaki?
Takaki.
Takaki. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's see. Somebody just observed that Guantanamo is another example of the U.S. being hypocrites regarding human rights. Jennifer. Here's a question. What about people in the U.S. who are not against the Chinese people, but only against the Chinese Communist Party? How does this stance affect Asian Americans?
I'd love to take a crack at this one if that's okay.
You got it.
So,
Go right
When-
ahead.
when the United States is engaged in conflict with another country. This is true currently with China, as it was during the War on Terror, when tensions first erupted against Iraq. What ended up happening in the case of Iraq, right? A lot of the anti-war organizers at the time, were trying to make the case of, look, if you can't just claim to not have a side in this. If you claim both sides are bad, you're still supporting and endorsing the United States' efforts. And a lot of these people who said that were decried as being supporters of a dictatorship. They were, called genocide deniers. They were called every name in the book. Iraq has been laid to waste by the United States since then. So, as anti-imperialists, I don't think we have time for both sides are bad rhetoric when the United States is the one initiating aggression in the first place. The United States is the one that initiated that trade war with China that left sectors of the American economy devastated. The United States is the one that initiates these propaganda campaigns that try to force Chinese companies to be sold to American interests. Furthermore, polls have consistently shown that the ruling party in People's Republic of China has the majority support of its people. That's never happened in the United States. I don't think there's ever been a time in the United States history where the overwhelming majority of our population supported our government. You can say you're against the Chinese Communist Party all you want, but this is a party with a democratic process that its own people have participate in elections and choose these leaders and choose these representatives. When you say you stand against the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party but support the Chinese people, you clearly don't, because their will is what allows that government to exist in the first place. If they didn't want it to exist, they would do what the people of Venezuela did. They would kick out that government. The people of Venezuela have kicked out governments they didn't like 4 or 5 times in the past 100 years. That's what people of China did in 1949 when they didn't care for the way that government was being run. The people of China have their own will, their own ability. They can determine for themselves who is the right actor for their government. And so long as we support the people of China and support them against aggression from the United States, then we support their own ability to choose their own leaders, even if you don't particularly agree with those leaders.
Okay. Is there an issue with how the U.S. tries to frame or define human rights across the West versus how it is accepted in the East and elsewhere? Is there an issue with how the U.S. tries to frame or define human rights across the West versus how it is accepted in the East and elsewhere?
I would say yes. I don't very much understand the second part as far as how it's received. But to go back on Autumn's point earlier, the U.S. really has no grounds on determining, who is actually violating human rights and not, because the U.S. is the main violator of human rights historically. Just going back on the history, we understand how the United States and America, United States of America came about through the attempted genocide of indigenous people and stealing their land, through the development of this land by stealing African people and African resources and using it as slave labor, and the continuation of that process and anti-Blackness to maintain this sort of power, not only by continuing that slave labor through the prison industrial complex, and the points that Autumn made as far as the high percentage of people the U.S. has incarcerated and in solitary confinement, and is using their free labor to advance corporations, basically, and advance the corporate sector in America. Because of that, I think that is where the perception is flawed on human rights, and how the United States tries to use human rights as an excuse for and to justify their intervention in various countries. I don't know if that answered the question. Maybe the first part, I don't know so much about the second part. I think to answer the second
An issue, is there, I mean, I think clearly there is an issue with how the U.S. tries to frame and define human rights across the West versus how it's accepted in the East and elsewhere.
I think like one way,
so, you know, whose business, that's their business,
right?
not our business.
To go on that second part, as far as how human rights are received, there's a Kwame Ture quote where it says, what is, as far as what is freedom, right? A lot of people in America like talking about freedom of speech, freedom of this, freedom of that. Well, what about the freedom to not die of hunger, or the freedom to not be homeless, or the freedom to have your material needs met? And I think that should be one of the determinants of human rights, right? Are the material conditions of the people being met? Are they not starving their people, or the conditions being created to where the people don't have access to medical resources, or things like that? So I think
just to life, the right to life.
Exactly, and I think that's one of the differences in the perceptions of human rights in the East versus the West.
Thank you. Patricia said on April 10th is Myanmar National Day. So that date makes it sense for a rally to take place. Said the Fort Worth rally was well attended. What are some specifically Asian American organizations in Dallas or in the Metroplex working on the problem of racism? Some specifically Asian American organizations in this area working on the problems of racism.
I'm not incredibly familiar. I know Jonas Park was one of the participants earlier, but he already left, and he began the anti-Asian hate, or there's a specific name for it. Dallas, there's an Instagram for it, and he's an Asian American. So that's the one I know about. There's I think it's anti-Asian hate Dallas is the handle or something of that, something like that. It's the wider campaign that's been going around, but it just has Dallas at the end of it would be the handle. That's the one I'm aware of.
Yeah, I was actually just going to mention that it's Stop Asian Hate. There's a Facebook group for it, and I know there's also organizing around a solidarity group for Asian people in the area that would cover issues for solidarity between Asian people and BLM, as well as issues affecting the Asian community. And there's a bit.ly link for it to get involved, which is bit.ly /AAPIDFW, I think is the URL. Yep, so that's another one.
Thank you. Someone says, I recently watched a film called Sea Drift, Refugees, Racism, Reconciliation, that focused on the relationship residents of Seadrift, Texas, and newly resettled Vietnamese refugees over a period of time from 1970 to relatively recently, the relationship between them. So that was that's Seadrift, Refugees, Racism, Reconciliation. So it's a film. Let's see. Um, so I think that is pretty, let me double check and make sure that we've addressed everybody's questions and comments. Let's see. Anybody have anything that they want to offer, or any comment that you want to make, or question, final question that you may want to make now before we close? Well, I want to thank everyone for your participation. This has been a really excellent experience, and I look forward. I'm so happy to hear and get to meet everyone here. And Dan, do you have any final thoughts that anything that we need to do in terms of housekeeping, or we've got about 5 minutes left in our original time that we had planned for.
Oh, no, I'm one of the organizers with the anti-war committee who helped to pull this together. And like Kit, I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Patricia, who probably produced about half of the very useful questions and comments, and the other people who contributed on that, including Julie and Kira. I thought the panelists were really very excellent. I hope you all follow us on Facebook, Dallas Anti-War Committee, and you can find us very easily there. And that we'll see more of you in the future. And thank everybody for coming.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to be able to listen in on this.
Good night. Night all.
Good night.